Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, let's talk about the science. Why don't we start there? Good place to start, Mr. Speaker. There's extensive research and a growing body of scientific publications that have reported damage to DNA, malformation of embryos, damage to cells, endocrine disruption, and other effects on enzymes associated with glyphosate and its additives in a wide range of species, including humans. A consensus statement published this last year in the Journal of Environmental Health by a dozen leading scientists and epidemiologists concluded a number of things, including that the regulatory estimates of tolerable daily intake for glyphosate in the U.S., for example, is based on outdated science. Now let's just take a look at what these dozen scientists and epidemiologists wrote in their consensus statement in the Journal of Environmental Health 2016, volume 1519, Mr. Speaker. So they say, with respect to glyphosate-based herbicides, we are certain of the following. Glyphosate herbicides contaminate drinking water via rainwater, surface runoff, and leaching into groundwater. The half-life of glyphosate in water and soil is longer than previously recognized. The risk of long-term incremental buildup of glyphosate contamination in soil, surface water, and groundwater is driven by highly site-specific factors, and as a result, is difficult to predict and to monitor. Residues of glyphosate and its principal metabolite, AMPA, are present in nearly all soybeans harvested from fields planted with Roundup-ready soybeans. Section 2. These 12 scientists and epidemiologists in their consensus statement published in Environmental Health said, we estimate with confidence that glyphosate provokes oxidative damage in rat liver and kidneys by disrupting mitochondrial metabolism at exposure levels currently considered safe and acceptable by regulatory agencies. Let me read that one more time slowly. Glyphosate provokes oxidative damage in rat liver and kidneys by disrupting mitochondrial metabolism at exposure levels currently considered safe and acceptable by regulatory agencies. Secondly, residues from glyphosate herbicides may pose higher risks to the kidneys and liver. Metabolic studies in a variety of laboratory and farm animals show that levels of glyphosate and the metabolite AMPA in kidney and liver tissues are 10 to 100 times higher than the levels found in fat, muscle, and most other tissues. Increase in the frequency of serious chronic kidney disease have been observed among male agricultural workers in some regions in which there's a combination of heavy glyphosate herbicide use and hard water. 3, glyphosate and its metabolite AMPA are not monitored in the human population in the United States despite a 100-fold increase in the use of glyphosate herbicides over recent decades. Let's say those things are cause for concern, Mr. Speaker. In their section 3, current models and data from the biological sciences predict the following. 1, that glyphosate and glyphosate-based herbicides disrupt endocrine signaling systems in vitro. Rat maternal exposure to a sublethal dose of glyphosate-based herbicides resulting in male offspring reproductive development impairment. Resulted in male offspring reproductive development impairment. As an endocrine disrupting chemical, glyphosate can alter the functioning of hormonal systems and gene expression patterns at various dosage levels. Next, current models and data from the biological sciences predict that the incidence of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma has nearly doubled in the United States between 1975 and 2006. Glyphosate-based herbicides are implicated in the heightened risk of developing non-Hodgkin's lymphoma among human populations exposed to glyphosate occupationally or by virtue of their residence in an area routinely treated with herbicides. An interesting side point, Mr. Speaker, is that the Canadian Health Agency suggests that there's significantly elevated levels of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma in men in New Brunswick compared to the rest of Canada. And regionally in New Brunswick, in northern New Brunswick, the rates are double that in the south, Mr. Speaker. Glyphosate is a chelating agent with potential to sequester essential micronutrient metals such as zinc, cobalt, and manganese. This property of glyphosate can alter the availability of these nutrients for crops, for people, for wildlife, for pets, and livestock. These micronutrient metals are enzymatic cofactors, so their loss has the potential to contribute to a number of deleterious effects, especially on kidney and liver function, Mr. Speaker. Now, the next section, existing data suggests but does not empirically confirm. Okay, so it suggests but does not empirically confirm a wide range of adverse outcomes. Multiple studies on glyphosate-based herbicides have reported effects indicated of endocrine disruption. The action of glyphosate as an antibiotic may alter the gastrointestinal microbiome in vertebrates, which could favor the proliferation of pathogenic microbes in humans, farm animals, pets, and other exposed vertebrates. Increased incidence of severe birth defects in Argentina and Paraguay in areas where glyphosate has been sprayed. Glyphosate has shown to increase retinonic activity during fetal development in those areas. Glyphosate-contaminated soybean feeds used in the pork industry have also been associated with elevated rates of gastrointestinal health problems and birth defects in young pigs. Some developmental studies in rats undertaken at relatively high levels of exposure suggest possible glyphosate-induced neurotoxicity through multiple mechanisms. Glyphosate may interfere with normal sexual development and reproduction in vertebrates. A recent report demonstrates that environmentally relevant concentrations of commercially available glyphosate herbicides alter the susceptibility of bacteria to 6 classes of antibiotics. Furthermore, glyphosate-based herbicides can also induce multiple antibiotic-resistant phenotypes in potential human pathogens such as E. coli and Salmonella. Such phenotypes could both undermine antibiotic therapy and significantly increase the possibility of mutations, conferring more permanent resistance traits. And, Mr. Speaker, experiments with zebrafish with dosing of glyphosate herbicides in the upper range of environmentally relevant contamination levels showed morphological damage to ovaries, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Section 5, uncertainties in current assessments persist because, for example, the first and only in-depth U.S. Department of Agriculture testing of glyphosate and its metabolite AMPA residues in food-targeted soybeans occurred once in 2011. Of the 300 samples tested, 90.3% contained glyphosate at a mean level of 1.9 parts per million. Glyphosate, Mr. Speaker, residues are generally uncontrolled for in the standard rations fed to animals in laboratory studies. And let me say, Mr. Speaker, that in fact people should recognize that most of the studies that have been done, that are done on pesticides, and all of them to be registered to receive approval to be used, are done for the manufacturer of the pesticide. So they're submitted by the manufacturer of the pesticide, and only later, as problems and concerns start to arise, do independent studies start to get done, as this has been indicated. So, Mr. Speaker, implementations here of this consensus statement, the margin of safety between typical glyphosate and exposure levels and the maximum allowed human exposures has narrowed substantially in the last decade. The margin may well have disappeared for heavily exposed segments of the population in some countries. They conclude, Mr. Speaker, that existing toxicological data and risk assessments are not sufficient to infer that glyphosate-based herbicides as currently used are safe. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to repeat that because the Minister of Environment, and I think also the Minister of Energy and Resource Development, said that this is safe if it's used, if the instructions on the label are followed. What these prestigious scientists and epidemiologists conclude is that existing toxicological data and risk assessments are not sufficient to infer that glyphosate-based herbicides as currently used are safe, Mr. Speaker. So this is important. This suggests to me, I don't know what happens when you get on the other side of the House, Mr. Speaker, but you start hearing industry talk coming out of the ministers responsible rather than using their own intelligence, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to addressing such important issues as the use of hazardous chemicals in our environment and the impacts those might have ecologically and on people. Mr. Speaker, I think it's important to also reference the fact that the member for Gagetown-Petitcodiac referenced a series of pesticides that we'd used, and later they were banned because of problems that occurred with them. Well, Mr. Speaker, this occurs because in every case, as you look back through history, there has been a concerted, industry-led campaign, Mr. Speaker, to sow doubt, Mr. Speaker, that magnifies and exaggerates the inherent uncertainties in the science of toxicology and epidemiological studies as a way of delaying regulatory action on their pesticide, Mr. Speaker. That's why it's taken so long in the past to ban DDT or to ban Agent Orange, Mr. Speaker, or to get rid of phenetrethion, Mr. Speaker. So this is an important thing to remember. We were told by manufacturers all of these things were safe, and then campaigns are mounted to delay any action when doubt arrives, to delay any action to tighten the regulation or ban them. So, Mr. Speaker, recently in New York State, there was a court case that was brought by people who had contracted non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, who were concerned that and believed that this was related to their exposure to glyphosate. The files that were unsealed by Judge Vince Chabria, who was presiding over that litigation, provided some pretty startling information, and this was reported in the business section of the New York Times on March 14, 2017. The court documents included Monsanto's internal emails and email traffic between the company and federal regulators. The records suggested that Monsanto had ghost-written research that was later attributed to academics and indicated that a senior official at the Environmental Protection Agency had worked to quash a review of Roundup, which is glyphosate, which is manufactured by Monsanto's, of their main ingredient, glyphosate, that was been conducted by the United States Department of Health and Human Services, Mr. Speaker. The documents also revealed that there was some disagreement within the Environmental Protection Agency over its very own safety assessment of glyphosate, Mr. Speaker. Court records show that Monsanto was tipped off to the determination by the World Health Organization that it was a probable human carcinogen, which led the company to prepare a public relations assault on the findings well in advance of its publication. Monsanto executives in their internal email traffic said they had promised to beat back any effort by the Department of Health and Human Services in the United States to conduct its own review. Dan Jenkins, a Monsanto executive, according to the story, said in an email in 2015 that he was referring to the other agency's potential review. He said, "If I can kill this, I should get a medal." The review never took place. In another email, Mr. Jenkins, a Monsanto executive, according to this story in the New York Times, noted to a colleague that Mr. Rowland was planning to retire and said he could be useful as we move forward with ongoing glyphosate defense, Mr. Speaker. In one email unsealed as a result of these court proceedings, William F. Haydens, a Monsanto executive, told other company officials, according to this newspaper story, that they could ghostwrite research on glyphosate by hiring academics to put their names on papers that were actually written by Monsanto, Mr. Speaker. What kind of faith, Mr. Speaker, can we have about what it says on the label when these kinds of hijinks are going on? Quote is, "We would be keeping the cost down by us doing the writing ourselves, and they would just edit a sign and sign their names, so to speak," Mr. Speaker, responding to the scientists who would sign these ghostwritten research. So, Mr. Speaker, these disclosures certainly were the latest to raise concerns about the integrity of the academic research financed by agrochemical companies, much of the research, initial research financed about the safety of glyphosate, Mr. Speaker, and this, in fact, is in the public record, Mr. Speaker. This was available to the Minister of Energy and Resource Development to review or for his staff to provide him. It was available to the Minister of Environment to review or for his staff to provide him, and they chose, Mr. Speaker, not to address any of this information that I brought forward today in the Legislative Assembly, Mr. Speaker. So I thank my colleague from the riding of Gagetown for bringing Gagetown-Petitcodiac for bringing forward this motion. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Monsieur le Président, j'aimerais souligner les accomplissements de Matthew Casey et France Daigle qui ont été honorés par les anciens étudiants de l'Université de Moncton le 19 octobre. Ils ont reçu respectivement le prix Émergence et l'Ordre de Mérite. M. Casey est un conseiller en francophonie multilatérale pour le gouvernement du Nouveau-Brunswick et premier fonctionnaire provincial à occuper ce poste en France, avec statut diplomatique maintenant. Madame Daigle, un écrivain, était honorée pour l'excellence et l'originalité de son œuvre, ainsi que son apport exceptionnel au rayonnement de la littérature acadienne et au débat public. J'invite tous les députés présents de me joindre à féliciter M. Casey et Mme Daigle pour ces titres prestigieux.